The rain had not yet reached Rosemere Hall when Wren Calloway heard the crying. It came from behind the yew hedge at the far end of the formal garden, a small broken sound, the kind a child makes when he believes no one is listening and has stopped trying to be brave about it. Wren had slipped away from the drawing room precisely because she could not bear one more moment of her sister being admired. She had not expected to find someone more miserable than herself. She followed the sound past the sundial, past a stone bench slick with the coming storm, until she found him. A boy of perhaps 6, in a coat far too fine for a child who had clearly been rolling in the flower beds, his cravat torn loose, his dark hair stuck to his forehead with tears and sweat. He had wedged himself into the narrow gap between the hedge and the garden wall as though he meant to disappear into it. "Oh," Wren said softly, crouching so she would not tower over him. "There you are." He flinched as if she had shouted. "Go away. I don't want the painting. I won't sit for it. I won't." "I don't know anything about a painting," Wren said, which was true. She did not recognize him at all. A guest's son, perhaps, brought along the way children sometimes were, dressed like a small ornament, and expected to behave like one. "But I do know that hiding place is a very good one. I nearly walked right past you." That at least earned her a suspicious glance instead of another sob. "It's the best one. Nobody finds it. I found it." "You weren't looking for me." "No," she admitted. "I was looking for somewhere to cry myself, if you must know." "So we have that much in common." The boy's swollen eyes widened, as though the idea that a grown woman might also want to disappear behind a hedge had never occurred to him. He studied her the way children do when they are deciding whether an adult can be trusted, not by her words, but by whether her face matched them. Wren kept her face very still and very honest, because she had learned, in 23 years of being the plain daughter beside a beautiful one, that children could smell a performance the way dogs could smell fear. "Why were you going to cry?" he asked at last. "Because sometimes a person can stand in a room full of people and still feel as though she isn't in it at all," Wren said. "Do you know that feeling?" He nodded, slow and solemn, and something in her chest ached for him in a way she did not examine too closely. "They talk over me," he said, "like I'm a chair. Or a dog. Everyone bows to me and nobody looks at me. That does sound very lonely. I'm not allowed to be lonely," he said, with the peculiar gravity of a child repeating something he has been told too many times. "I have a duty." Wren felt the strangeness of that sentence pass through her, a boy of 6 speaking of duty as though it were a coat he'd been buttoned into before he could walk. But she did not press him on it. Instead, she settled herself onto the wet grass beside the hedge, heedless of her hem, and said, "Well, I have never met a duty yet that couldn't wait a quarter of an hour for a person to catch his breath. Shall we sit here together and not be found for a little while?" He looked at her for a long moment, and then, astonishingly, he crawled out of his gap in the hedge and sat beside her, close enough that his small shoulder pressed against her arm. "You won't tell them where I am?" "I promise," Wren said, and meant it with the whole of her heart, not knowing yet what that small promise would cost her, nor what it would come to mean. She did not know his name. She did not ask it. It did not occur to her, in that hour, that the boy weeping in a hedge with grass stains on his fine coat was Frederick, Prince of Vaerlyn, the only living heir of Crown Prince Damien Ashworth Vaerlyn, third in line to a throne that had, in the space of 18 months, buried a queen, a king, and very nearly lost its future to grief. She knew only that he was a small, unhappy child who needed someone to sit beside him and not require anything of him at all. She gave him her handkerchief, embroidered with a crooked W her mother had never quite forgiven her for stitching so badly, and she told him a nonsense story about a fox who could not find his way home because he had forgotten which door was his. until his hiccuping sobs eased into ordinary breathing and, eventually, into a small, reluctant laugh. It was the laugh that carried across the garden wall, bright, surprised, entirely unlike the practiced titter Wren heard so often in the drawing room she was dragged through. And it was the laugh that brought a man striding around the hedge with his jaw set, and his eyes already narrowed for battle, prepared to find his son in the clutches of some indignity, and finding instead a young woman in a mud-hemmed gown, sitting cross-legged on wet grass, holding his son's hand as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Wren looked up and felt her stomach drop straight through the earth. She did not know, in that first frozen instant, who he was. She knew only that he was tall in the particular way that made a person's spine straighten without meaning to, that his coat was cut with a severity too plain to be anything but very costly, and that his face, handsome in a hard-weathered way, like a cliff the sea has been working on for years, wore an expression of such raw, unguarded fear that for a moment she forgot to be afraid of him at all. "Freddie," the man said, and his voice cracked on the single syllable. The boy scrambled up. "Papa, I'm sorry. I ran away from the painting. I couldn't. You are not hurt." It was not quite a question. The man crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and dropped to one knee in the wet grass without any apparent concern for his coat, gathering the boy against him with both arms, his eyes closing briefly as though he were absorbing a blow rather than delivering an embrace. Wren rose slowly, brushing uselessly at her skirts, acutely aware that she had just been discovered alone with a strange child by a man who looked, in that moment, entirely capable of having her thrown from the estate without a character. "Forgive me," she began. "I found him crying by the hedge, and I only meant to. You found him." The man's eyes came up to hers, and there was something in them she could not name. Not quite suspicion, not quite gratitude. Something raw and unfinished, like a wound that had only just stopped bleeding. "Alone, crying, and you did not run for a servant." "I did not think a servant was what he wanted," Wren said, before she could stop herself. "I thought he wanted someone to sit with him." The man studied her for a long moment that felt like several minutes, his hand still resting protectively on his son's shoulder. "Most people," he said at last low, "would have run for a servant, or worse, made a show of it, sent word ahead, announced that they had rescued him." His mouth twisted faintly on the word, as though it tasted bitter. "You did neither." "I did not know there was anyone to announce it to," Wren said honestly. "I only knew there was a child crying, and no one comforting him." Something shifted behind the man's eyes. She would not understand, for weeks yet, precisely what it was, though she would come to recognize it later as the particular ache of a father who had watched every person who approached his son do so with calculation, and who had, for one unguarded quarter-hour, found someone who had not. "I am obliged to you," he said, and the words sounded stiff, unpracticed, as though gratitude were a language he had once known well, and had lately forgotten how to speak. "May I ask your name?" "Miss Wren Calloway," she said, and dropped a small correct curtsy, though her heart was hammering absurdly hard for so simple an introduction. "My father is Sir Thomas Calloway. We arrived only this afternoon, with the other guests for the house party." "Calloway." He said it as though testing the shape of it. "I do not believe we have been introduced, Miss Calloway." "No, my lord," she said, assuming him some manner of gentleman attached to the household, a steward perhaps, or a distant cousin of standing, for she had noted the fineness of the boy's coat, and assumed some connection to the family that owned Rosemere, though she could not have said which. "I did not think it my place to intrude on your son's grief with questions of rank." For the first time, something that might almost have been the ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "No," he agreed. "I do not suppose you did." He did not correct her. She would understand, much later, why, that in the small precious space of that garden, For the length of one conversation, he had been permitted to be simply a frightened father, and not the Crown Prince of Vaerlyn, and he had not been willing, yet, to give that up. By the time Wren returned to the house, the light was failing, and her mother was already in a state. "Where in heaven's name have you been?" Lady Calloway hissed, catching Wren by the elbow the moment she stepped through the garden door. Her eyes sweeping over the grass stained him with an expression of pure horror. "Look at you. Look at the state of you, and on the very first evening, with half the guests still arriving. What will they think?" "I doubt anyone was thinking of me at all, Mother," Wren said, which was in its way the truest thing she had said all day. "Marigold has been asked no fewer than 4 times whether she means to walk in the garden tomorrow," her mother went on, as though Wren had not spoken. "Lord Ashby asked it twice. Twice, Wren. And where were you?" "Sitting in the mud like a milkmaid." Across the hall, Wren's sister stood before a gilt mirror adjusting a curl that did not require adjusting, glowing with the particular ease of a woman who had never once in her life doubted that a room improved the moment she entered it. Marigold was, by any fair measure, lovely, golden-haired, quick-tongued, blessed with the sort of unthinking charm that made men forget their own names, and Wren had long since stopped resenting her for it, because resentment required energy she did not have to spare. It was easier simply to step back. She had been stepping back since she was 12 years old, and their father had first looked between his 2 daughters at a country assembly and said, not unkindly, but not carefully either, "Well, Marigold shall have to do the marrying for both of you." "I only went out for air," Wren said now. "You are 23, her mother said, lowering her voice to the particular register she reserved for reminding Wren of arithmetic she had not asked to be reminded of. "This house party is very likely your last real chance, Wren, and I will not have you throw it away crawling about in hedgerows. Do you understand me? Sir Thomas has put us badly in debt securing this invitation. We cannot afford for it to go for nothing." Wren said that she understood, because it was easier than explaining that she had spent the last hour with a weeping child whose name she did not know, and that it had been, without question, the finest hour she had passed since arriving at Rosemere. She did not learn his name until the following morning, when the guests were assembled in the great hall for the formal welcome, and the Mayordomo's voice rang out over the crowd, announcing the arrival of His Royal Highness, Crown Prince Damien of Vaerlyn, and his son, Prince Frederick. Wren's teacup very nearly slipped from her hand. He entered as a different man entirely from the one who had knelt in wet grass the evening before, dressed now in dark, formal severity. A thin gold circlet at his brow, the only ornament he permitted himself, his expression schooled into the particular blankness of a man who has learned that every face in a crowded room is watching him for a weakness to exploit. Beside him, small and stiff in a new coat, walked Freddie, his hand tucked into his father's, his eyes scanning the crowd with the wary alertness of a child who has learned that rooms like this one are not safe for children. Then his gaze found Wren's across the whole width of the hall, and his whole face broke open with delight. "That's her," he announced in the carrying voice of a 6-year-old entirely unburdened by discretion, tugging at his father's sleeve. "Papa, that's the lady from the garden." A ripple of interest moved through the assembled guests like wine through wheat. Wren felt every eye in the room swing toward her, felt her mother's hand close like a vise around her wrist, felt her sister's carefully arranged expression falter, for just an instant into something sharper. And she felt, worst of all, the Crown Prince's eyes find hers again, no longer soft with a father's private gratitude, but guarded now, assessing, aware of the dozens of watching faces, aware of what it meant for his son to have called out to a stranger with such unguarded joy in front of the entire assembled nobility of 2 counties. "Miss Calloway," he said, and his voice was perfectly correct, perfectly cool, betraying nothing of the man who had knelt in the grass. "I believe I owe you a proper introduction, and a proper thanks. "There is no debt, Your Highness," Wren managed, her curtsy considerably less steady than it ought to have been. "Your Highness." The words rang strangely in her own ears, absurd, as though she had misheard them. She thought of the mud on her hem the evening before, of telling a prince of the realm a nonsense story about a fox who had forgotten his own door, of the plain honesty with which she had spoken to him, not knowing, not once suspecting on the contrary, he said. "I think there is rather a considerable one." He did not linger. He could not, surrounded as he was by a hall full of people already reorganizing their opinions of Sir Thomas Calloway's plain daughter in real time, already calculating what it might mean that the Crown Prince had singled her out on his very first morning at Rosemere. But as he turned away, Freddie broke free of his hand entirely and ran the length of the hall to fling both arms around Wren's skirts. And the sound that went through the crowd, half delighted, half scandalized, was the sound of gossip being born. "You still have my handkerchief," she said to him, crouching, laughing despite herself, despite the dozens of watching eyes. Because his small face was so entirely without artifice that it seemed a sin not to answer it honestly. "I kept it," he said, as though this were a great secret. "I didn't tell anyone about the fox story. It's ours." "Ours," Wren agreed, and did not look up to see whether the prince had heard, though something in her chest told her, with a small, frightened certainty, that he had. The Dowager Duchess of Harrow, aunt to the Crown Prince and self-appointed guardian of what remained of his good sense, observed the scene from the gallery above with an expression that would have curdled cream. "A nobody," she said to the woman beside her, not troubling to lower her voice, for she had never in her life troubled to lower her voice for anyone she did not consider her equal. Some baronet's daughter, by the look of her gown, and the boy clinging to her like a burr. This is precisely the sort of unfortunate attachment we must nip before it roots. The woman beside her, elegant, dark-haired, dressed in a shade of blue that had clearly been chosen to be remarked upon, smiled the particular smile of a woman who has decided, in advance, that she has already won. Lady Cordelia Fenwick had come to Rosemere with a single object in mind, an object her own mother had been cultivating for the better part of 2 years, the restoration of a Crown Prince's household, and her own name upon it. She was clever, and composed, and entirely capable of charm when charm served her purposes, and she had watched the scene in the great hall with the cool attention of a general watching an enemy's opening move. "He has always been sentimental where the boy is concerned," Lady Cordelia said. "It is understandable, given what the child has lost. It will pass." "See that it does," the Duchess said. "Vaerlyn cannot afford a prince distracted by hedgerow romances. Cordelia, the succession has been unsettled quite long enough. Damien has grieved for 18 months. That is honourable. It is also, at this point, becoming a liability to the crown." Below them, oblivious, Wren was being extracted from the hall by her mother, with a firmness that bordered on violence. Murmuring apologies to no one in particular, while Marigold watched the retreating scene with an expression Wren did not see, and would not have understood if she had, the swift, calculating recalculation of a beautiful woman who has just discovered that her plain sister has, entirely by accident, captured the single most valuable attention in the room. "He will forget her within the week," Lady Calloway assured her husband that evening, though her tone suggested she was working rather hard to convince herself. "Princes do not marry baronets' daughters who fall down in gardens." "No," Sir Thomas agreed, though he was watching Marigold rather than Wren as he said it, and Wren, standing quietly by the window with her needlework forgotten in her lap, understood perfectly well what calculation was forming behind her father's eyes. If the prince had noticed a Calloway daughter, then a Calloway daughter he should have, only let it be the correct one. She did not blame them for it. Precisely, She had grown up watching her family arrange itself around Marigold's beauty, the way a garden arranges itself around its single flowering tree. And she had learned long ago that there was no use resenting the shape of the ground. But that night, alone in the small guest chamber she had been given at the far end of the corridor, she found herself taking Freddie's crumpled handkerchief from her sleeve and pressing it briefly to her cheek, and admitting to herself, with the particular honesty a person only permits in the dark, that she did not want to be forgotten within the week. Not by the boy, and God help her, not entirely by his father either. It was foolish. She told herself so at least a dozen times before she slept. A crown prince did not marry baronets' daughters, and even if he had wanted to, which he did not, which he could not, which no sensible person would even entertain for a moment, he had a country that needed heirs and alliances, and a woman of proper birth, none of which Wren Calloway could offer him. She was 23 and unremarkable, and had until yesterday believed herself entirely resigned to it. It was only the strangest, cruelest sort of luck that the one afternoon she had let her guard entirely down had been witnessed by the one man in the kingdom whose notice could undo her peace so thoroughly. She resolved, lying awake listening to the rain finally arrive against the window, to be sensible, to keep her distance, to let the small warm thing that had bloomed in her chest in that garden wither quietly, as such things were meant to, before it could do either of them any real harm. She had not accounted for Freddie. He found her the very next morning, in the corner of the library where she had gone to hide from the breakfast room, and its endless, exhausting talk of who had danced with whom the previous season. He simply appeared at her elbow with a book too advanced for him tucked under one arm, and announced, without preamble, that he had been made to sit for the portrait after all, and that it had been dreadful, and would she like to hear about it? She would, she told him, and meant it. It became, over the following days, a small and entirely unplanned ritual. In the hour between breakfast and the ladies' obligatory morning calls, when the rest of the household was occupied with the particular business of being seen, Wren would slip into the library, or the orangery, or, once, memorably, the stables, and find Freddie already waiting, or find him within minutes of her arrival, as though he had some private means of tracking her through the house. He told her about his mother, in the fragmented, matter-of-fact way children speak of loss, before they have learned to be careful with it, that she had smelled of orange blossom, that she used to let him stay awake past his hour if he promised not to tell his father, that she had died when the fever came through the eastern wing 2 winters past, and that his father had not smiled properly since. "He smiles at me," Freddie said, one afternoon in the orangery, turning a fallen lemon over in his small hands. "But it's a careful smile, like he's afraid it will break if he does it too hard." Wren's throat tightened at that, at the terrible precision of a child's grief, and she found herself, more than once, glancing up to find the Crown Prince himself, standing in a doorway or at the edge of a garden path, not approaching, simply watching. Watching his son laugh with an ease he no longer seemed to laugh with anyone else. Watching Wren answer the boy's endless questions with a patience that cost her nothing, because it did not feel like patience at all. It felt like joy. He did not join them in those first days. He was, she came to understand, a man who had trained himself severely against the indulgence of wanting things, and it was some while before she understood that his distance was not coldness, but its opposite, that he was afraid, in the particular specific way of a man who has already lost one person he loved to a fever no physician could turn back, of allowing himself to want anything at all that could be taken from him. It was Freddie, in the end, who forced the matter, dragging his father bodily into the orangery one wet afternoon, and declaring that Wren simply must hear the story of the fox again, properly, because he had told it wrong twice already, and she deserved to hear it done well. "I don't believe I know this story," the prince said, and there was something almost helpless in his expression, the look of a man being swept along by a current considerably stronger than his own resistance. "Sit down, Papa," Freddie ordered, with the imperiousness of a small tyrant, and to Wren's lasting astonishment, the Crown Prince of Vaerlyn sat on an overturned crate among the lemon trees, and listened gravely to his son's garbled, enthusiastic account of a fox who had forgotten which door was his own. And then Freddie finished, breathless with the triumph of a story well told. Miss Calloway said the fox only needed someone to remind him he was allowed to go home even if he'd been lost a long while. And then he wasn't lost anymore. The prince's eyes came up to Wren's, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, and the silence between them was not the correct, careful silence of two strangers observing propriety, but something else entirely, something that felt, absurdly, like being seen. "That is," he said at last, quietly, "a very good story." "It is only a nonsense story, Your Highness," Wren said, flustered by the weight of his attention, by the particular gentleness that had crept into his voice. "I made it up on the spot. I hardly expected it to be remembered. Some of the best things are made up on the spot," he said, and remembered regardless. He did not stay long after that. Duty called him away within the quarter hour. Some matter of correspondence from the capital that could not wait even for his son's happiness. But he left with a small, unguarded backward glance that Wren carried with her for the rest of the day, like a coal held too close to her chest, warm and dangerous, and impossible to set down. The change in the household did not go unremarked. Where once the gossip of Rosemere had circled dutifully around Lady Cordelia Fenwick's prospects, her blue gowns, her practiced laugh, the careful way she arranged herself in the prince's path at every ball and breakfast, it began, in the space of a fortnight, to circle instead around the odd, persistent fact that His Royal Highness could most reliably be found not in the card-room or the billiard hall with the other gentlemen, but wherever his son happened to be, which was to say, wherever Miss Wren Calloway happened to be. It was Marigold who noticed first, and Marigold who acted on it. "You have been very sly, sister," she said one evening, drawing Wren aside in the corridor outside their rooms, with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Playing the devoted governess to secure what you could never win by ordinary means. I confess I did not think you had it in you." "I am not playing anything," Wren said, stung. "I am fond of the child. That is all it is." "That is not all it will be taken for," Marigold said, "once people begin to talk properly. And they will, Wren, they already have. Do you imagine the Duchess of Harrow has not noticed? Do you imagine Lady Cordelia has not noticed? You are making yourself a spectacle, and when this ends, as it must end, because it cannot possibly end any other way, it is you who will bear the shame of it, not him. Princes are never shamed, only the women foolish enough to love them." The word love landed with an unexpected violence, and Wren found she had no ready answer for it, because some traitorous part of her recognized the accusation as true even as the rest of her rejected it. She had not meant to love him. She had meant only to be kind to a grieving child, and kindness had led her, step by unguarded step, into feeling that had no business existing between a baronet's plain daughter and the future king of Vaerlyn. The Duchess of Harrow, for her part, did not wait for gossip to do her work for her. She summoned Wren to the small sitting room off the East Gallery 2 mornings later, under the pretext of thanking her for her attentions to the prince, and delivered instead, with the chilling civility of a woman accustomed to command, precisely the message she intended. "You have been kind to my great-nephew," the Duchess said, seated very upright in a chair positioned so that the light fell unflatteringly upon her visitor, rather than herself. "I do not doubt your intentions are innocent, Miss Calloway. I will even credit you with good sense enough to know your own position. But you must understand what you are doing to him. I do not believe I am doing anything to him, Your Grace, beyond offering him some small comfort. "You are giving a lonely child hope of a mother he cannot have," the Duchess said, without cruelty, which made it somehow crueler than if she had shouted it. "And you are giving a grieving prince the dangerous idea that his heart is his own to give where he pleases. It is not. It has not been, since the day he was born. His Highness will marry Lady Cordelia Fenwick before the year is out. The arrangement has been under discussion since before you arrived at Rosemere. Discussed between families who understand precisely what is owed to the crown and what is not. It is a kindness, Miss Calloway, that I tell you plainly now, before matters progress any further than a child's affection and a prince's momentary distraction. Better a small hurt now than a scandal that ruins you both." Wren sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, and felt something in her chest crack quietly, without sound, the way ice cracks beneath a weight it was never meant to bear. "I understand you, Your Grace," she said, when she trusted her voice again. "I have never imagined myself anything to His Highness beyond a passing acquaintance of his sons." "Good," the Duchess said, rising. The interview plainly concluded. "See that it remains so." Wren did not cry until she had reached the privacy of her own chamber, and even then she permitted herself only a quarter hour of it before she washed her face and resolved, with the particular grim determination of a woman who has been humiliated and intends never to be humiliated in quite that way again, to withdraw. She would still be kind to Freddie when kindness was asked of her, and could be given without remark. But she would no longer seek him out. She would no longer linger in libraries and orangeries hoping to be found. Whatever small, foolish thing had begun to grow in her these past weeks, she would starve it quietly, privately, and no one, least of all the prince himself, would ever need know it had existed at all. It was, she thought, the sensible course. It was also, she discovered over the following days, very nearly impossible to keep. Freddie noticed her absence within a day. By the third, he had taken to appearing at inconvenient moments, in the corridor outside the drawing-room, at the edge of the terrace during the ladies' tea, tugging at her sleeve and asking, with wounded bewilderment, why she no longer came to the orangery, whether he had done something wrong, whether she did not like him any more. "Of course I like you," Wren told him, crouching to his level in the shadow of a hallway alcove where she hoped no one would observe them, her heart breaking a little with every word of the careful, necessary lie she was about to tell. "I have simply had a great many letters to write, and calls to pay with my mother. That is all it is." "You're lying," Freddie said, with the terrible clarity of a child who has already lost one grown woman he loved to circumstances no one explained to him properly, and does not intend to be managed the same way twice. "Everyone lies to me. I thought you were different." He ran from her before she could answer, and Wren stood alone in the alcove with her hand pressed to her mouth, understanding for the first time the full dreadful weight of what she had agreed to, that in trying to spare him a small hurt now, she was very likely delivering him a larger one. The particular cruelty of being abandoned by someone who had let him believe, however briefly, that he was not. It was that evening, at the grand ball held to mark the formal opening of the autumn season, that matters came to their crisis. The ballroom at Rosemere had been transformed for the occasion into something out of a fever dream of gold and candlelight, every chandelier blazing, every mirror doubling the light until the whole room seemed to shimmer. Lady Cordelia Fenwick, in a gown of deep sapphire that had plainly been commissioned for precisely this evening, stood at the prince's side throughout the receiving line, with the settled ease of a woman already halfway to being announced, and the Duchess of Harrow watched the arrangement with the satisfied stillness of a general observing a battle already won. Wren, in a gown 3 seasons out of fashion that her mother had insisted would do perfectly well, stood near the edge of the room with Marigold glowing beside her, and told herself, with each passing quarter hour, that it did not matter, that she had made her choice, that watching the prince lead Lady Cordelia out for the opening set was precisely the outcome she had spent a full week preparing her heart to endure. It did not help in the slightest. She watched him move through the formal steps of the dance with the same schooled correctness he brought to everything, his eyes finding hers, once, across the width of the ballroom, holding for a fraction of a second too long before duty pulled his attention back to his partner. And Wren understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that whatever careful withdrawal she had constructed over the past week had done nothing whatsoever to the thing growing quietly in her chest. It had only taught her how much it cost to pretend otherwise. It was in the middle of the second set that a footman appeared at the edge of the ballroom, white-faced, and made his way with urgent haste to the Duchess of Harrow's side. Wren watched the exchange from across the room, watched the Duchess's expression shift from irritation at the interruption to something sharper, something alarmed, and watched her cross swiftly to the prince, murmuring something that made every trace of correctness drop from his face at once. "The young prince has taken ill." The whisper reached Wren within moments, passed hand to hand through the crowd with the terrible speed gossip always achieves when it concerns tragedy. "A fever. Sudden and very high. The physician has been sent for." Wren did not remember deciding to move. She remembered only that she was already crossing the ballroom, skirts gathered in both hands, heedless of the eyes that followed her, heedless of her mother's sharp, scandalized whisper of her name, heedless of everything except the image of Freddie alone and frightened in some unfamiliar sick room, calling, perhaps, for someone who was not there. She reached the foot of the great staircase just as the prince himself was ascending it 2 steps at a time, and something in her face must have stopped him, because he turned. And for a single unguarded instant the whole careful architecture of his royal composure fell away entirely, and she saw only a father, terrified. "He has been asking for you," the prince said, his voice rough, stripped of every formal edge. "Since the fever began. He will not settle. He keeps asking why you left him." "I did not leave him," Wren said, and the words came out cracked, half a sob. All the careful distance she had constructed over the past week collapsing at once. "Take me to him. Please." The nursery, when they reached it, was a small, close room lit by a single lamp turned low. The physician bent over the narrow bed where Freddie lay tossed and restless among tangled sheets, his face flushed, his small hands plucking at nothing. The governess hovered helplessly near the door, wrung out with worry and the particular guilt of a woman who has watched a child suffer and found no way to comfort him. "He will not be soothed," the physician said low, without looking up from his work. "The fever must simply run its course, Your Highness. But a restless patient makes for a harder night. If there is anything that calms him, Miss Calloway," the prince said. Now, Wren crossed to the bedside without waiting to be asked twice, and sank onto the edge of the mattress, taking one of Freddie's hot, damp hands between both of her own. "Freddie, I'm here." His eyes, glassy with fever, found her face, and something in his small frame eased at once. Some of the frantic tension going out of him, like a held breath finally released. "You came back," he whispered. "You said you had letters." "I did have letters," Wren said, her voice unsteady, "but none of them mattered half so much as you do, and I was a great fool to let you think otherwise, even for a day. I am here now, and I am not going anywhere, and you are going to be well again very soon. Do you understand me?" "Tell the fox story," Freddie said, his eyes already beginning to drift, exhaustion and fever pulling at him even as he fought it. "The one about coming home." So she told it, softly, steadily, her voice the only thing in the small room besides the physician's quiet instruments and the prince's silent watching presence in the doorway. The story of a fox who had wandered so long and so far that he had forgotten which door was his, until someone reminded him, gently, that being lost a long while did not mean a person forfeited the right to come home. She told it 3 times over, in a low, unhurried voice, until at last Freddie's breathing evened and deepened into the heavier rhythm of true sleep. His small hand still curled around one of her fingers even in unconsciousness. The physician pronounced, some while later, that the fever had broken to a manageable degree, that the worst danger had passed, that with rest and quiet the boy would very likely be entirely himself within a few days. Wren did not leave the bedside even then. She sat through the small hours of the night in a low chair someone had brought for her, Freddie's hand never quite releasing hers. And it was there, sometime past 2 in the morning, that the prince came at last to sit in the chair beside her. Neither of them spoke for a long while. The house had gone quiet around them, the ball long since abandoned. The guests dispersed to their rooms to whisper over what they had witnessed. Somewhere below, Wren imagined, the Duchess of Harrow was already composing the version of events she meant to tell, and Lady Cordelia was already recalculating her position, and her own mother was very likely lying awake in a state of pure horror at what her plain, unremarkable daughter had done, running through a ballroom full of the finest families in the kingdom, in pursuit of a sick child who was not her own to claim. Wren found she could not make herself care, not tonight, not with Freddie's small hand warm and trusting in hers. "I owe you an apology," the prince said at last, very quietly, so as not to wake the boy. "I have watched you these past days holding yourself away from him, from us, and I told myself it was propriety, that you had simply grown weary of a household not your own. I did not ask why. I should have asked why." "It does not matter now," Wren said. "It matters a great deal," he said, and there was something rough beneath the careful evenness of his voice. "My aunt spoke to you. I know she did. She has spoken to every woman who has ever come near enough to Freddie or to me to matter, and she has done it with my tacit permission for 18 months, because I told myself it was easier to let her manage what I did not have the courage to face myself. I am asking you to tell me, plainly, what she said." Wren hesitated, and then, because she was tired and frightened, and had spent a full week performing a composure she did not feel, she told him, the arrangement with Lady Cordelia, the warning about hope and heartbreak, the plain instruction that she withdraw before matters progressed any further than a child's affection and a prince's momentary distraction. The prince was silent for a long moment, his jaw working, his eyes fixed on his sleeping son. "There is no formal arrangement with Lady Cordelia," he said at last. "There has been discussion. My aunt has been eager for it, and I have not been eager enough against it, because for 18 months I did not believe myself entitled to want anything for myself at all. My wife died believing I had failed to protect her from a fever no one could have stopped. And I have spent every day since telling myself that the price of that failure was to give up any claim to my own happiness, and to arrange my life instead entirely around duty, because duty at least I could not fail at so completely." "You did not fail her," Wren said softly. "I know that, in the part of my mind that reasons," he said. "I have not, until recently, known it anywhere else." His eyes came to hers then, and there was nothing schooled or careful in them at all. "You did not perform kindness for my son because you calculated some advantage in it. You did not know who he was. You did not know who I was. You sat in wet grass with a weeping stranger's child because he was weeping, and that is the rarest thing I have encountered in 18 months of being surrounded by people who want a great many things from me, and have never once simply wanted to sit beside me while I grieved. Your Highness, Damien," he said. "If you would, just once, tonight, while my son sleeps and no one is watching to calculate what it means." "Damien," Wren said, and the name felt like something precious and dangerous in her mouth. "I did not mean to love him. Or you. I want you to understand that. I did not come to Rosemere seeking anything beyond a quiet fortnight in my sister's shadow, as I have spent every house party of my adult life. I have no dowry to speak of, no connections worth the name, nothing to offer a prince of the realm beyond what I gave your son in a garden, which was nothing more than attention, freely given." "It was not nothing," he said. "It was everything I have watched every other woman in this house fail to offer him, because every other woman in this house has understood, correctly, that attention paid to a lonely prince's grieving son is attention that might eventually purchase something greater. You alone did not understand that. You alone gave it for no reason but that it was needed." He reached across the small space between their chairs and, very gently, covered her free hand with his own. "I do not know what is possible, Miss Calloway. I know what my aunt will say, and what the court will say, and what it will cost a crown already unsettled by grief to see its future king marry a baronet's plain daughter with no dowry and no connections. I know all of that, and I find tonight, sitting here, that I no longer care to let it decide my life for me." Wren's breath caught. "You cannot mean that." "Not truly. Not after one strange, frightening night. I mean it more than I have meant anything in 18 months, he said. "But I will not ask you to answer me tonight, with my son fevered between us and the whole house in an uproar below. I will ask you only to let me prove it to you properly, in daylight, before witnesses, without the excuse of a crisis to explain it away. Will you permit me that much?" Wren looked down at Freddie's sleeping face, at the small hand still curled trustingly around her own, and felt something in her chest that had been guarded and shuttered for 23 years crack open at last, wide and frightened and hopeful, all at once. "Yes," she whispered, "I will permit you that much." Morning did not bring the daylight clarity either of them had hoped for. It brought instead the Duchess of Harrow, informed before breakfast of precisely how the Crown Prince had spent his night, and arriving at Wren's chamber door with a face like a gathering storm. "You were warned," the Duchess said, not troubling to enter, delivering her words from the threshold as though the room itself might be contaminated by prolonged proximity. "I gave you every opportunity to withdraw with your dignity intact, Miss Calloway, and instead you have made yourself the subject of gossip in every drawing-room from here to the capital. Do you imagine this ends well for you? Do you imagine a prince's infatuation, born of one frightened night, survives the return of ordinary daylight and the weight of a crown that requires alliances? Not sentiment?" "I imagine," Wren said, with a steadiness that surprised her, "that His Highness is capable of deciding for himself what he requires, Your Grace, and that it is not my place nor yours to decide it for him." The Duchess's eyes narrowed. "You are bold for a woman with nothing to recommend her." "I have my honesty to recommend me," Wren said. "I have never once claimed to be anything other than what I am. I cannot say the same is true of everyone currently competing for His Highness's regard." She thought, as she said it, of Lady Cordelia's careful positioning, of the arrangement discussed between families who understood what was owed to the crown, and found she was no longer frightened to say so plainly. The Duchess left without another word, but the look she carried away with her promised the matter was far from settled, and Wren understood, dressing for breakfast with hands that would not quite stop trembling, that the true battle had not yet been fought at all. It came, in the end, not in a private sitting-room, but in the breakfast hall itself, before the full assembly of Rosemere's guests, where the Duchess of Harrow rose from her place with the deliberate theatre of a woman who has decided that public humiliation is the surest weapon remaining to her. "I think it only fair," she announced, into a room that fell instantly, hungrily silent, "that our company understand precisely what transpired last night, before certain parties are permitted to construct a more flattering account of it. His Royal Highness's son took ill during the ball, a fact for which I am given to understand Miss Calloway bears some indirect responsibility, having so thoroughly attached herself to the boy's affections over recent weeks that his fever brought on. The physician confides. A fit of hysteria specifically calling for her presence. One wonders what manner of ambitious young woman cultivates such a dependency in a motherless child, and to what end. A murmur went through the room, ugly and quick, and Wren felt the old, familiar instinct rise in her, to shrink, to apologize, to disappear quietly the way she had disappeared from 100 rooms before this one, ceding the space to someone louder and more certain of their right to occupy it. She felt Marigold beside her go very still, watching, and for one terrible moment Wren believed her sister might add her own voice to the accusation. Might see in this public spectacle one final opportunity to clear the field entirely. Instead, astonishingly, it was Marigold who rose. "Forgive me, Your Grace," Marigold said, and her voice, though it trembled slightly, did not falter. "But I have watched my sister with that child for a fortnight, and I have watched you, and the difference between ambition and kindness is not so difficult to discern as you suggest. My sister asked nothing of Prince Frederick, expected nothing, gained nothing from her attention to him beyond his company, which she gave freely because he needed it. I have been unkind to her my whole life, out of vanity I am not proud of, and I will not compound it now by standing silent while she is slandered for the crime of being good to a grieving child. If ambition explains her conduct, Your Grace, I confess I cannot see it, and I have looked rather harder than most in this room, having competed against her, however unfairly, for a great many years." The silence that followed was absolute. Wren stared at her sister, throat too tight for speech, understanding for the first time in 23 years that Marigold's careless cruelties had never been the whole of her, only the easiest part to see. It was into this silence that the Crown Prince entered, Freddie's hand in his own, the boy pale still from his fever but steady on his feet, and it was Freddie who spoke first, in the clear, carrying voice children use when they have not yet learned that some truths are meant to be managed rather than simply spoken. "She's not ambitious," Freddie announced to the room at large, with the devastating sincerity of the very young. "She's my friend, and I heard Papa tell her last night that he loves her, so I don't understand why everyone is being so unkind about it at breakfast." Wren felt the blood leave her face entirely. Across the room, Lady Cordelia's composure cracked for the first time in 3 weeks, and the Duchess of Harrow's mouth opened and closed without sound. And the prince, to Wren's everlasting astonishment, did not deny it, did not scramble to correct his son's artless honesty, did not retreat behind the careful correctness that had governed every public moment of his life since his wife's death. He crossed the room instead, in front of the whole assembled company, and took Wren's hand in both of his own. "My son has, as usual, said plainly what I have spent a week failing to say with proper ceremony," he said, his voice carrying easily through the silent hall, steady in a way that left no room for doubt. "I did tell Miss Calloway, last night, that I loved her. I meant it then, and I mean it now, before every witness in this room. And I will say further, that I intend to marry her, if she will still have me after this rather less elegant declaration than I had planned, and that any objection to the match on grounds of birth or fortune may be raised with me directly, in my capacity as future king of this realm, rather than whispered over breakfast at the expense of a woman who has done nothing in this house but show my son the first unguarded kindness he has known in 18 months. He turned to Wren then, and though the room was full of witnesses, though the Duchess of Harrow stood rigid with fury, and Lady Cordelia's face had gone perfectly dangerously blank, he asked his question as though they were entirely alone. "Will you, Wren? Not out of duty, not out of pity for a grieving father and his motherless son, but because you want to, as plainly and honestly as you have wanted everything else since the day I found you in the grass." Wren looked at him, and at Freddie's small, hopeful face beside him, and at her sister still standing in unexpected, hard-won solidarity across the breakfast table, and felt 23 years of learning to expect nothing, to want nothing too loudly, to step back and make room, and disappear quietly into the shadow of someone lovelier, fall away from her entirely. "Yes," she said, and her voice did not shake at all. "I will." The Duchess of Harrow left Rosemere within the week, her objections overruled by a prince who had, for the first time since his wife's death, remembered that a crown was not the whole of what he owed his kingdom. He owed it. 2. A king who was not afraid to be happy. Lady Cordelia, for her part, accepted the outcome with a grace that did her more credit than her scheming ever had, and found within the year an attachment of her own, one built on rather steadier ground than a borrowed crown had ever offered her. The wedding, when it came in the spring, was smaller than the court proper for a future king, held in the chapel at Rosemere rather than the grand cathedral in the capital, because Freddie had asked, with the particular stubbornness of a much-loved child, that it happen in the garden where the story had truly begun. And no one, not the Archbishop, not the assembled nobility, not even the new Dowager Duchess, chastened and distant but no longer dangerous, had found it in themselves to refuse him. Wren wore no jewels but a small worn handkerchief tucked into her sleeve, embroidered with a crooked W she had never learned to stitch properly, and when Freddie asked her, halfway through the ceremony, in a whisper considerably louder than he intended, whether this meant she would be his mother now and stay forever, she crouched in her wedding gown, heedless of the grass, and told him that she was not going anywhere, not now, not ever, that some people simply needed reminding they were allowed to come home, and that he, and his father, and the small, stubborn, hard-won family the three of them had built from a single afternoon of tears in a garden, had shown her, at last, exactly the same thing in return. She had come to Rosemere expecting to be overlooked, as she had been overlooked her whole life, standing quietly in her sister's shadow while the world arranged itself around someone lovelier. She left it instead as the woman a future king had chosen, plainly, publicly, and entirely for love, not because she had learned to compete for notice, but because, for one unguarded hour beside a weeping child who did not yet know his own worth, she had simply forgotten to hide. In the years that followed, the story of the Crown Prince, who had found his future queen weeping with a lost boy behind a garden hedge, became one of those tales the court told and retold, until no one quite remembered which details were true, and which had been softened by fondness into something closer to legend. Some said she had been a governess. Some said she had rescued the young prince from a runaway carriage. Wren herself never troubled to correct them, because the truest part of the story, that she had simply sat down in wet grass beside a crying child and stayed, seemed to her too plain and too precious a thing to need embellishing. Freddie grew, in time, into a young man who carried his mother's memory with tenderness rather than grief, and who spoke of Wren not as a stepmother endured out of duty, but as the woman who had taught him, on the worst afternoon of his young life, that being lost a long while did not mean a person forfeited the right to come home. He kept, all his life, a small and rather badly stitched handkerchief in a drawer beside his bed, and told the story of the fox to his own children one day, in a voice that had by then learned exactly how his father's careful, unbreaking smile was meant to sound. Damien, for his part, never again let 18 months pass without remembering to be glad of what he had. He governed his kingdom in the years that followed with the particular steadiness of a man who had learned, the hard way, that duty and happiness were not opposing forces to be weighed against one another, but two halves of the same whole. And he credited the lesson, whenever he was asked, to a plain and honest woman who had never once, in all the years he knew her, tried to be anything other than exactly herself. And Wren, who had spent 23 years learning to expect nothing, to want nothing too loudly, to step quietly back and let the room belong to someone lovelier. Wren, who had gone into that garden looking only for a private place to grieve her own smallness for a quarter of an hour, and had found instead a weeping child, and a frightened father, and, eventually, a whole life she had never once dared to imagine wanting. Wren never forgot the particular, quiet miracle of it, that the smallest kindness, offered with no thought of reward, had been enough, in the end, to change the shape of a kingdom, and to teach a prince, and a boy who would one day be king, and a plain, overlooked young woman who had never once believed herself worth choosing, that love did not always announce itself with fanfare and firelight. Sometimes it knelt quietly in wet grass, and simply stayed,